All right, good evening, folks, and thank you for joining us. My name is Andy Trinan. I'm the president and the CEO here at the Fraser History Museum. It is our great honor to host this program tonight, Hidden History, brought to you by Fifth Third Bank. We are so happy to have Fifth Third as our sponsors. I'm joined by my colleague and my good friend, Rachel Platt. I've been hosting programs in one way or another with Rachel Platt since 2006 when we worked together at WHS 11. Rachel is now, we're happy and thrilled to have her as our Director of Community Engagement here at the Fraser History Museum. Rachel?
Right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And Andy, tonight we're all going to be saying a whole lot. We think, I didn't know that, because we're talking about hidden history here with Kentucky, hence the name of our program, Hidden History. As we all continue, as we know, to dig and learn, we know that our history books fell short. As a matter of fact, they fell way short of that fuller history. So tonight we're going to introduce you to a few people who certainly deserve our attention for their many accomplishments.
Yeah, and all of these people are featured in our new exhibit, Cool Kentucky. Not cool because of what happened to them, but cool because of the amazing things that they had to overcome to be great, to be cool, to be relevant here in the state of Kentucky and to be relevant in the world. Now, before we quickly introduce our panel, we want to throw out a couple of names to our audience. We always like to engage you early on, see if you have heard of some of the names that we're going to be talking about tonight. You have likely heard of the name Thomas Edison, an inventor, but what about the name Garrett Morgan? We're going to put that up on the screen and allow our guests to engage in that one way or another. Have you heard of Garrett Morgan? Yes or no? Go ahead and put that answer on your screen. And we're really excited, Rachel, that by the end of the evening, folks are going to know a whole lot about Garrett Morgan.
Absolutely. These, we have household names. This probably should be one of them. So we're going to let you weigh in. We'll see if we have our poll results here with, have you heard of the name Garrett Morgan? 21% of you say yes. 79% of you say no. You've never heard of the name Garrett Morgan. Well, stay tuned. Now we have another question for you. You've likely heard of the names Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, but do you know the name Willa Brown? So we're going to put question 2 up. Audience, go ahead and weigh in. Have you heard of Willa Brown? We'll give you a couple seconds to weigh in, and then we'll see the results of that. So remember, 79% had not heard of Garrett Morgan. What about the name Willa Brown?
Willa Brown is featured in our Cool Kentucky exhibit under Great Kentuckians. And it's one of the great things about hosting an exhibit like this is we are learning so much as we go about great Kentuckians who've had an impact on the world. Let's see the answer to that. Have you heard of Willa Brown? Better percentage there. 22 people, 40% have heard of Willa Brown. 33 folks, 60% have not. All right, our final question for you. You obviously know of the Lewis and Clark story. We learned about it growing up. Do you know the name York? I'm guessing the answers are going to be a little more in favor of York because of our first guest tonight, but we will allow our audience to weigh in. Have you heard of York? Yes or no?
We'll give you just a second to weigh in and see what the results are of this. All right, LP, go ahead and let's see if we have results for this. Whoa. 91% say they have heard of York. Only 9% say they have not. And as Andy said, chances are if you've heard of York, it's because of sculptor Ed Hamilton and his York statue that resides on the Belvedere. And the magnificent Ed Hamilton is on our panel tonight, and we'll be talking about York in just a few minutes. So look at the Ed, you've got to have a good feeling in your heart knowing that you have put, in many ways, York on the map with people knowing his story.
Yeah, it's an important part of telling the story. We're going to be getting to our other 2 names that we asked you about as well, Garrett Morgan and Willa Brown, and many more. Our other panelists who will be introducing you to some of the hidden history will be the curator from the Fraser History Museum, our curator, Amanda Brady. We're also lucky enough to have Jermaine Fowler, the founder and storyteller with the Humanity Archive, and we will briefly explain that in just a few minutes.
We also have Carol Ely, you can see right there, the executive director of Locust Grove, will join us to talk about the work they've been doing to uncover hidden history and names we need to know at Locust Grove. And Christine Ingalls, the archives manager, will join us from the Cincinnati Museum Center. Thank you so much, Christine, to talk about a man who revolutionized the bed frame, and a bed frame that they loaned us here at the Fraser. And it is a story that I've got to tell you, I've become obsessed with. I know Christine is. She said she was doing research right before the program, learning even more about Henry Boyd. We're going to be talking about him as well. Andy?
A man with no grave marker in Cincinnati after having an incredible impact on the city and the state and the world. Later in the program, Cheryl White will join us as a question facilitator, because we always want the audience to weigh in when we have programs like this. We do our best to ask good questions, but we know that the audience has great questions and we want to give them the opportunity. Cheryl is with the African American Business Resource Group with Fifth Third Bank. You can ask your questions right there in the chat feature, or the Q&A feature on Zoom, or the comments section if you're one of the folks who are joining us on Facebook tonight.
All right, so Cheryl will be joining us a little bit later in the program to ask some of your questions. Before each of our panelists does a presentation on some of these hidden figures that we've been talking about, we wanted to just start with a quick question to each of you with about a 30-second answer before your presentations. Ed, let's start with you on this. Your 8-foot sculpture of York was commissioned by the city. How deep do you go, the deep dive you do before creating a likeness like this one?
Well, most of my commission works, before I even began to try to visualize, I try to learn as much as I can about my subject. And the more I know about my subject, the more deeper I can get into them. Unfortunately, I had no concept or any reality of York or who he was until Jim Holmberg of the Filson's Club handed me a book called In Search of York. And I would read this book when I would take my mother to Kroger's, and she would stay in there for like 3 hours because, you know, the elderly love to go up and down the aisles and meet their friends. So I'm out in the car reading this book, and I learned quite a lot about York at that point. So that allowed me to really get into his persona. Otherwise, you know, if an artist doesn't do the research, then you're just making a mannequin.
Well, we look forward to the deeper dive in just a little bit. Jermaine, let's go to you next. Uncovering this history is what really Humanity Archive is all about. Why is it so important to you?
I think for these Kentuckians in particular, the things that stand out to me is Black agency, because you had these figures all who did things in the face of things like Jim Crow, Jane Crow, segregation, and they defiantly didn't let that define them, and were able to push past that to go on to do these great, amazing things. And I can't wait to share some of them with you.
And Carol, let's go to you, because you all have been doing so much work now with I know a huge part of your mission now at Locust Grove is uncovering some of this hidden history. What has struck you the most about it in all of this uncovering? What would you say? Oh, let's unmute you, Carol. There you go. Thank you, ma'am.
Got it?
You got it.
Yeah, that it is really possible to start to get some insights into the lives of people who are enslaved, who have not had a way to have a voice, through research in all kinds of different sorts of methods, from archaeology to newspaper archives. We've been able to find out details of their lives that are reveal something of who they were as individuals, not just as workers, not just as people who were victimized.
Well, I think we've all admired your work in doing that. So thank you for that work. Christine Ingalls with the Cincinnati Museum Center. Look, I grew up in Cincinnati, spent the better part of my life there, and I didn't know Henry Boyd's story. So what is it that struck you about his story?
I think what struck me the most about him was just the perseverance that he had. When I learned that his factory had burned down 3 times, and he just continually kept getting up in the face of very bad opposition. I admire his tenacity or stubbornness.
Yeah, I mean, I know you're going to be getting into that because it eventually, I think those fires ended up putting him out of business, which was just tragic. Amanda, how about you? You've been doing a lot of deeper dives for us here at the Fraser. What has been striking you the most about these hidden histories?
Yeah, so for this program, we're focusing primarily on the African American stories. But for my research in the suffrage exhibit that we have, and for Cool Kentucky, I've just been so struck by how many Kentuckians of so many different backgrounds have made their mark on the world in so many different areas, from scientists to ballerinas. I had no idea that so many different kinds of Kentuckians had done so many different kinds of cool things.
We're still
Excellent.
learning. Yeah. Thank you, Amanda.
And we're going to continue to learn tonight. So here's how the rest of the program is going to play out. Each panelist is going to introduce us either to one or a few names in a couple of cases, just about a 5-minute presentation from each. And then we're going to open up the questioning to the audience.
All right, so we're going to get started with Ed Hamilton, who's going to tell us about York. Go ahead, Ed.
Well, as we know, York actually grew up on William Clark's father's plantation out of Virginia. And they grew up as boys together. Unfortunately, as they aged, the dynamics changed. And we can only assume that York became Clark's manservant up to that point. Now, when he got the call to be a co-captain of the expedition that Thomas Jefferson put together to explore the Louisiana Purchase territories, I would suppose William Clark told York, let's go pack our bags and let's go down to Louisville to embark on this expedition. The expedition was a military expedition, and York was the only Black person on that expedition. And so in my research, there were no pictures of York. And so through the book, as I said before, In Search of York, it allowed me to kind of visualize what this man would look like, his physical being, and how he would fit in on this expedition. Can you imagine going on such an expedition, going through territories up north, going through Native American territories? And some of the Native Americans had never seen a Black man before. And in one encounter of the Native American territories, one of the chiefs, as he was in front of the group going in, the chief saw this Black man and thought, who is this man? And he literally spit on York's arm to try to rub the Black off. This particular group of Native Americans, Native Indians, when they were on a successful hunt, they would come back to the village and paint themselves with coke, charcoal, coke. And they thought he was a white man painted with charcoal. And all of a sudden he became very special, and they called him Big Medicine. And so every time they would go through these areas, they would put York up out front, because there were certain groups of natives that did not particularly care about white men coming through their territories. So we can say that York played a big part in this expedition. There were like 30-some people, and he was the only Black. Chicago Weir was the only woman. And when they would come to a fork in the road, as they would go through the parts of the river areas that would split, they would vote on how to go, which way they would go. Can we imagine that York was the first Black man to vote with a group? You see, at that particular period of time. Well, as we know, they were successful. They got to where they wanted to go. They saw the Pacific Ocean. They came back. Unfortunately, everybody got accommodations. Everybody got to go to the White House. They got land, they got money. York got nothing. William Clark said, I dare you be insolent. And so he put him in a tray business, going up and down, selling goods. I can't imagine how that worked out. All York wanted was his freedom. He wanted to come back here and spend time with his wife. Her name was Rose. We can only know that after a 10-year period, Clark says he freed York. We don't know that as a fact. Then he says he died of cholera in Tennessee. We don't know that as a fact. What we do know, there was an old black man on a Crow reservation up in the northern coast of where they had gone before, and people were encountering him, and he was telling people he was on the Lewis and Clark expedition. So I like to think that he went back after he did not get his freedom, as Clark said he did, went back up into the native lands and spent the rest of his life on an Indian reservation where he had encountered when he was on the expedition. So I tried to picture York as a strong black man who did his part on this expedition. And you see him holding a 54 rifle, flintlock rifle. He's got a couple of ducks that he would have hunted. He's got his powder horn that kept his powder safe, his his little bag on the side. And he would have had a floppy hat on the little model that I created, but I took the hat off because I didn't want the light, sunlight, and the light to interfere with that face. And so I pictured him as a very powerful man. And I think and he's looking north toward the area where the expedition started off at from Louisville. And so he's an 8-foot bronze statue, a very tall man on this bluff, overlooking and thinking, my, how things have changed, or look at where I'm at now. So that's my York. And I like to think that he did his part. He did his part.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And you have done your part, Ed, and you've done some amazing things. Where does this rank? Because, you know, part of the reason that more people know about York is because of that prominent 8-foot statue that sits on the Belvedere in a very key downtown location. You brought this story to a number of people. So where does it rank in what you've accomplished as an amazing sculptor?
Well, it's hard for me to rank them because that's like me saying, well, do I like my son or do I like my daughter? Who do I like best? So they all have their place, you know, in history. They all tell a story. But maybe I think because of his prominence here in Louisville, he holds a high bar here, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
I think he holds a high bar.
Ed, I know back in my HAS days, and then we'll move on to Carol, just indulge me for a second. I remember when I got to go to your studio and watch you work. And it was almost like a religious experience for me, I have to tell you, because of how you inhabited that person and how you said you spoke to them, you were looking in their eyes. It's like you had this amazing relationship with this person that they became part of you almost in a way. I mean, you spoke to them and they spoke to you.
Well, as a sculptor, you know, as I said, it's all in the research and it's all how you feel what you're working on and the clay. And clay has life, you know. One example, when I did the Spirit of Freedom in Washington, D.C., and you know, those were like 3 colored soldiers on the bas relief and a sailor, life scale. When I would cover them up at night, because if I don't cover them up, clay dries out. I have to keep them moist. I would come back the next day and the elderly soldier has sweat beads all around his face. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, have you guys come off the platform? Are y'all playing cards at night? Drinking maybe a little beer or something? Then you get back up there and you get back under your cover. You know, so it's a spiritual thing, you know. Creating something is very spiritual. And I don't know. Don't ask me how you do it. I can't tell you. It's God-given. It's special.
Well, I will tell you, I felt that when I went to your studio, and it was my privilege to be able to do that. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, now we wanted to go to Carol Ely with Locust Grove. You've got a lot of stories you're telling us about with the enslaved at Locust Grove, including Kit for starters. But you go ahead, Carol, and get started because I know you've got a long presentation here with many.
Now I'm feeling guilty about taking up your time.
No, not at all. We're thrilled.
just felt like so often enslaved people are seen as stereotypes. And I just wanted a chance to bring several of their stories to people and realize how much there really is there. So there should be a slide somewhere.
Yeah,
Maybe
we'll get to your
pull
first
that
one, right?
up. For those of you who don't know Locust Grove, originally was a 700-acre mixed farm in the east end of Louisville. It's now 55 acres, and it was started in the 1790s as the home of William and Lucy Cron. Lucy was a Clark, which is the relationship with Kit that Ed just talked about. So there are some overlap between the enslaved people at Locust Grove and Kit. York rather. They certainly knew each other very well. So the son of William and Lucy, John Cron, also bought Mammoth Cave. So there's stories of the enslaved at Locust Grove and at Mammoth Cave that overlap, and I'll tell you some of those stories too. Over the 60 years or so that the Crons owned Locust Grove, there were at least 70 people who were enslaved on the property, probably more, but we know the names of 70. At most, perhaps about 40, 42 people who lived there. So it was one of the larger farms or plantations of the era in Jefferson County. It was saved from demolition, becoming a suburb in the 1960s. And it was saved because of, not of the Crons, who most people will not have heard of, but George Rogers Clark, Lucy's brother, who lived his last 9 years and died at Locust Grove. And Locust Grove since the 1960s has been a nonprofit museum. So you're looking at a lovely snowy shot taken recently. Now you're looking though at the remains of a foundation that we think was one of the houses of the enslaved people at Locust Grove. And in the 1960s, when the site was purchased and restored, there really wasn't any thought of telling the stories of the enslaved. They were a footnote, if that, to the interpretation of the site, and the foundations of the buildings that they lived in were not restored. But by the 1990s, the people at Locust Grove had started to take note of the stories that they weren't telling and began research on the lives of the enslaved. Dr. Blaine Hudson of U of L, who we all owe a great debt to in our understanding of the lives of Black people in Louisville, was part of doing that initial research. And since then, we have continued. And as more archives have come online, it's become possible to learn more and more. Next slide. So we have some documents. Here you see a list of the people who at one point were associated with Locust Grove. And if you can read the script of the time, you'll see the cruel notations here that Peter is listed as idiot. Mary was crippled, Rachel was blind. And for a long time, this is about all we knew was the names and the values that the white people had assigned to them. And these characterizations. So starting with the documents, we started to look for other ways to piece the story together of these names and the others names that we found along the way. We have been emphasizing all along that these were not just workers, that while they were assigned a value here, that's not their value. They were human beings who had families and they had hopes and dreams and virtues and vices, and they experienced anger and they experienced pain and they experienced joy, and they were full human beings. So we're trying to restore their humanity by telling their stories. And some of what we found is really surprising and upend stereotypes, and we're not done at all. So next slide. The archaeology that we've done over the years, starting in the 1990s, is in some ways the truest source because it's not biased by other people's perceptions. It is biased by what survives. But here's a plate that was found in the area, go back to the plate, associated with the slave quarters. And this might not be what you would expect to see enslaved people eating off of. But in fact, they had a lot of objects that were passed down from the family that owned the big house. When something was broken or a set of china was being replaced by something more fashionable, often the remnants went into the slave quarters. So you would see fairly fine items, not necessarily in good repair in these areas. Now the next one. You're seeing a spoon, but if you look carefully at the X on the spoon, this starts to tell us a whole different story. The X is found on objects like coins and spoons and other places associated with enslaved people from Virginia to Georgia to Kentucky and beyond. And it is believed to be a religious symbol. It comes from Africa and represented a whole cosmology. And it shows the persistence of culture, that the people, even who were several generations away from the Middle Passage, had kept their culture and their religion and their traditions. This thing that you're seeing now about Kit is one of a number of graphics like this that we've created for each of the people that we have something to say about Locust Grove. And in some of them, it's just a line or two. In some, it's as full as what we know about Kit. So let's talk about Kit. He was probably related to York. We don't know exactly how, but they were together on John Clark's farm. He was born in about 1769, and his job was to be the body servant to George Rogers Clark. That means his job was to be with Clark and take care of his every need. And Clark, when he lived at Locust Grove, had needs. He had had his leg amputated, he had had strokes, and he needed care full time. Kit had some things that you might find unusual in his duties. He did shopping for George Rogers Clark. He carried money for William Cron. He was evidently entrusted with a great deal of physical freedom and also access to resources that you wouldn't always expect. Here is Clark's room at Locust Grove as we've restored it. And this is where Kit would have spent most of his time. If you look at the end of the bed there, you can see on the floor a pallet. Kit probably slept a lot of the time on the floor in Clark's room so that he would be available to take care of him night and day. We don't know if Kit had any other space that he lived in and what kind of living conditions he had, but for a long time he took care of Clark. We have a physical description of Kit. We know that he was 5'8" tall. We know that he was robustly built. He weighed about 180 pounds, 160, pounds. And he was, I'm quoting now, dark yellow complexion, a good and cheerful temper. This comes from a description from somebody who visited Clark. We know he wore nicely tailored clothes that were replaced frequently, made by the same tailor who made Clark's clothes. This shows that he was coming into contact with visitors and needed to present a certain status to the society. He was freed in Clark's will and apparently stayed nearby in the family for the rest of his life. But most people did not have those conditions. And here is a building at Locust Grove that we're currently re-restoring to represent the home of an enslaved family. Most of the people who were enslaved at Locust Grove did live in family groups, as far as we can tell, in buildings something like this, and had varied jobs around the property. The men worked as surveyors, assisting William Cron, as carpenters in the mill on the property, and even on a ferry, the farm distillery. And go to the next slide. We'll talk about the women who spent their lives not in rooms that look like Clark's with fancy wallpaper, but who spent their time caring not just for the family that lived in the house, the Crons and the Clarks, but for their own families. So they had a double set of duties there. Here we wanted to mention just a couple names of people that we're still researching. One is Louisa Brown, who had a family that grew up at Locust Grove. She has living descendants. And so we've recently located them and are trying to get in touch with them. The pandemic has slowed that down, but we're hoping that stories about Louisa and about her children have survived in the family as oral history, and we can get more of that. And I also wanted to mention a woman, Sylvia, who we've come across her in a letter from a Cron family member in March of 1833. She lost 3 children in one day in a cholera epidemic that was sweeping through Louisville and decimating the population. And later, several years later, in another family letter, it said that she is fond of whiskey and if hired out, would not live 12 months. And to me, I feel a connection here between the grief and the trauma that she experienced, the lack of any support she might have had to deal with that in losing so many members of her family. And no wonder she sought solace. But she was emancipated, and later, we believe, lived in Louisville with a surviving daughter and a granddaughter. So I hope she found some happiness there. And here's an actress. This is Patty Crawford, who plays the role of one of the enslaved women at Locust Grove for us. We have been working with actors from the African American Theater Program at the University of Louisville, and with Patty, who's a professional actress in the community, to literally embody the stories of these people and make it more real for our visitors. So we hope that once the pandemic passes, everyone can meet them. Another story that we have been able to piece together is Alfred. And we know his story almost from birth to death. There's a cute, and I'm putting cute in quotation marks here, story about how as a child he went searching for eggs and traded them for cake with family members. He was a coachman, we believe, and he became a cave guide when John Cron bought Mammoth Cave. And we are told by a visitor to the cave that Alfred, who was his tour guide, learned to read when very small, astonished his visitors by his use of scientific terms and his knowledge of chemistry and geology. And the visitor goes on to tell the story that Alfred was advised to purchase a Bible, and he said what he wanted to buy was Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he apparently purchased and read Uncle Tom's Cabin, an enslaved man. And he also was emancipated and had a role in creating a court case. The enslaved people at Locust Grove were freed in John Cron's will in 1849, but were told that they had to remain in Kentucky, had to leave Kentucky, could not remain. That was the law at the time. And he brought the court case, and the enslaved were allowed to remain in Kentucky. But soon after he was emancipated, he moved back to Louisville from Mammoth Cave and died in a street accident. He was, after all that time in Mammoth Cave, he died in a pit caved in Louisville. So a tragic end to that. But all of the sources that we, and by we, I'd like to credit our researcher, Heather Heiner, all of the stories that we had to put together to get the story of Alfred's life, from family letters to newspapers to the chance that a visitor to Mammoth Cave wrote about him in a book that was published. And this is Stephen Bishop, who is one of the names that you asked earlier people in the audience might possibly recognize his name, because he has some fame. He was a guide and an explorer of Mammoth Cave, one of the important people who mapped the cave. And in fact, he drew a map of Mammoth Cave in 1842 at Locust Grove that was published in the book Rambles in the Mammoth Cave in the year 1844. Here's the map that he drew. And see how he's credited, Stephen Bishop, one of the guides, right under the title. This is one of the earliest known publications by an enslaved person. He was still enslaved when this was published. He was, and we're not quite sure who actually wrote the book. He most definitely had a hand in it because he knew the cave better than anyone else, but he is credited with the map. And he was freed along with the other enslaved people of the Crons, and was hired for wages at the cave, but he also died just 3 years later. So here is the story that we have about him. And we have been putting these out on social media. I think we've got a couple dozen that are out if you follow Locust Grove on Instagram or on Facebook or Twitter. Stephen was a self-educated man. He had a fine genius, a great fund of wit and humor, some little knowledge of Latin and Greek, much knowledge of geology, but his great talent was a perfect knowledge of men, was what was said about him. And this is Xavier Harris, one of our actors, who portrays, I believe, Alfred. So this is what we're up to at Locust Grove. We're looking for these stories, trying to elevate the people as individuals. So thank you for giving me so much time. to talk about.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for the great work that Locust Grove is doing. It's certainly a blessing to our community. And now to a story that we're learning a whole lot about here at the Fraser. Rachel and our team in education with Amanda's help just put together a really nice story with the help of the Cincinnati Museum Center. There's a very special bed that's on view on loan from the Cincinnati Museum. It's actually on view for the first time to the public. Christine Engels is the archives manager from the center. She's joining us now. And Christine, I hope you've had as much fun learning this story and diving deeper into it as we have.
Yes, it's an amazing story. Henry Boyd was one of Cincinnati's most gifted and successful citizens. He was a master woodworker, an inventor, a master mechanic. He was best known for the beds that he made. However, he was born enslaved. He was born in 1802 on a Kentucky plantation. That's what I was researching today, was I was trying to figure out which plantation. It's not so easy. But he learned woodworking, became known as a very skilled man, and worked extra jobs, and was able to purchase his freedom in 1826. Some people believe, because he is listed in the censuses as mulatto, that perhaps his father was his enslaver, but again, that's one of those things you just don't know for sure, though in the 1880 census, he listed his father as being from Scotland. So when he moved to Cincinnati, to try to paint the picture here, what did Cincinnati look like? Cincinnati was only 34 years old when he arrived. Shortly after that, the city boomed. It was a big population, people migrating from the eastern part of the United States and people coming from Europe. So it was growing big, but it also was a city way too familiar with riots. And barely a decade passed in the 19th century without one or maybe two riots happening. Usually at the heart of these riots was economic issues and racism. And often Black workers and Irish workers were pitted against each other for scarce jobs, especially at times when the economy was bad or the river was low and there wasn't work. So Boyd faced an enormous amount of discrimination when he tried to find work in Cincinnati, which didn't make sense because the city was booming and there was plenty of work to be done. So people wouldn't hire him because he was Black, and other workers refused to work alongside him. So he had to start, it must have been incredibly frustrating to start at the bottom of the rung, unloading iron on the public landing. But he was tenacious. He went around to every shop. They knew who he was, and he made sure that he was able to stay in people's minds. So he got a job with a merchant, and just as a dumb luck, as the story goes, is another carpenter was supposed to do a job, but he was drunk. So Henry said, "Hey, I can do that," and he surprised the boss, and the boss was so thrilled with it. From then on, he never ever had to search for work again. He was very much in demand. So he started being kind of a general carpenter. He worked on houses and other things. And eventually in 1831, he opened his furniture business at 8th and Sycamore, and just became incredibly famous. Now, the thing about his beds, it's so unique, is he patented these side rails. It was swell rails that screwed in on each side. So it's just a very interesting design because it makes it very solid. And when you put more weight on it, it becomes even more solid. And as many people said, it was, they thought that would help keep vermin, bed bugs away if they wouldn't have anywhere to nest in the bed. One of the things I wanted to emphasize, I haven't seen a lot about, is that Henry was also very civically oriented, and his family, of course, was the core of his life. He had 2 daughters. He was married at least once that we know of, cassia laws, and his business was incredibly successful. In 1835, he was worth $3,000, which is close to $90,000 today. I mentioned earlier about the fires that he had. He faced so many obstacles because he had an integrated workforce. And some people did not like that. And some people were very jealous of his success. So he had 2 times Quakers helped him rebuild. And the third time, he could no longer get insurance, so he closed down his shop. So as I was also looking, researching of it yesterday, it's hard to find things about Henry Boyd. He's there, you can catch glimpses of him here and there in newspaper articles, but it's really hard to piece together a really coherent narrative. And so I found in the newspapers that he was listed as, and this is a quote, colored turnkey. So basically it was a station housekeeper for the 9th Street Ward. He was involved with the Grant Club, hosting lectures and different conferences. There's just too much to talk about him. I don't even have time to go into how he was credited with the first person to suggest that cholera was a waterborne disease, but that wasn't accepted then, unfortunately, though he is credited with that now. And so his story it just speaks to me of the determination he must have had from having to start all over from start in Cincinnati, and then several times being pushed back. It's just, he's an amazing man, and I feel honored to be able to tell his story at all.
Thank you, Christine. And I'm wondering, is he still in an unmarked grave? And has there been any effort to change that, to get a gravestone for him? Do you know, has there ever been an effort like that?
I don't know. I do know that I know where it is. I've figured out where it is because also his wife and one of his daughters is buried near him. But no, I don't think anyone I've heard anything about that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing the story of Henry Boyd. Now we want to go to Jermaine Fowler with the Humanity Archive. This is why you started this, was to tell hidden histories. And I know you've been researching many, but we want to start with Willa Brown because a lot of people in our audience didn't know who she was. So go ahead, Jermaine. I'm going to have you unmute yourself, and then we're going to have you go ahead and tell us. We'll start with Willa Brown.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Willa Brown Chapel, she was known as the mother of Black aviation, and she was born in Glasgow, Kentucky, and she was born in 1927. Well, we have to remember about 1927. Again, this is Jim Crow, this is Jane Crow, this is segregation, this is discrimination. So everything that she did, not only in her public life, but we don't even know what's going on in her personal life, but in her public life, she was facing up against these things. So she grew to become the first woman to get her aviator's license in America. So she was the first Black woman to do so. So here she is defying gravity in the air and racism on the ground to become this first Black woman to do this amazing thing. One story that really sticks out to me about her is whenever she hosted Enoch Waters, and he was the editor of the Chicago Defender newspaper. Now, the Chicago Defender, this was a newspaper that was the largest Black newspaper in America at the time. Black people couldn't really get coverage in the white newspapers during this time. So, Black people started their own newspapers, and Chicago Defender has a legacy in and of itself as this great newspaper. But she walks in, she says she wants to host an event. So she invites Enoch down, and she takes him on this flying excursion, and he goes up in the air with her. She's doing figure eights, she's doing stalls, she's doing flips, and he's ready to admit that she is one of the greatest pilots that he's ever seen, not only like because she's a woman, but the greatest in general. But it's a funny part of the story. He says he's not ready to admit that until his feet are planted safely on the ground. So this is her story. This is just somebody who can show us through history, like, it's a grand example of someone in history who fought against all the odds and who grew to become what she became. So I see you now have the picture of Isaac Scott Hathaway. He has a very fascinating story, and he was born in Lexington, Kentucky in 1872, and they called him Big Boots when he was a kid. It's kind of funny, but the story behind that is not funny. He had to wear his dad's Civil War boots. His dad was a Civil War veteran, and because of the crushing poverty of Reconstruction America facing many Black people at that time, he had to wear hand-me-down clothes from his dad. So what made him become a sculptor was a really interesting story. He's with his father, he's in Cincinnati, he's at a museum, and Isaac, he disappears. So his dad, he's mad, but he's also worried about him. So he finally finds him and he asks, where were you, son? And he said he was in the Hall of Busts. So the Hall of Busts, he's probably seeing statues of George Washington and Cicero or some Roman figures or whoever else they had in the museum. And he says, I was looking for a statue of Frederick Douglass. And using the language of the time, his dad puts his hand on his shoulder. He says, son, there are no Negroes in the Hall of Busts. So from that moment, Isaac knew that he was going to be the one to sculpt these busts of these great Black figures because he wasn't seeing those examples. So he grows in his craft, he becomes this great sculptor, and he's going to go ahead and be the one to sculpt Frederick Douglass himself. He's going to be the one to sculpt George Washington Carver. He's going to be the one to sculpt all these great Black figures. And what I really like about Hathaway is he didn't use his skills to make money. He used them for the greater good, because instead of doing these busts, in a certain way, he did them cheaply. So he made these little 12-inch busts. He made them out of plaster and he painted them bronze. That way that he could sell them cheaply to Black schools, and so that Black children could have them, on their shelves. So that is the story of Isaac Hathaway. Now, Elijah Mars, I see you have his picture there. He's another grand figure in Kentucky history. He was an educator. Many people know him as the co-founder of Simmons College here in Kentucky. But a lot of people don't know that he was actually, he helped recruit for the Civil War. So there's a story about him, and he helped enlist 27 other Black men to go to the Civil War. And, there's this quote, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something to the effect that we can stay here in Kentucky because of the racism going on here. And he says, we might die here, but if we go to war, at least if we die there, we die for our freedom. So that is him as a Civil War veteran. And he goes on throughout his life. He's this educator, and he moves around a lot because of his skills as an educator. And, he's still facing discrimination. There's another quote where he says he had to sleep with a pistol under his pillow because of the threats of the Ku Klux Klan during that time. So he couldn't live in peace. He always had to live, in fear of this retaliation, this discrimination, for just doing whatever he was born to do, trying to educate his people. So that is the story of Elijah Mars. And last but not least, we have Carl Bashir. He has a very fascinating story, one of grit, one of determination. He was born in Tonyville, Kentucky, and he wanted to be a Navy diver, but it wasn't so easy. This is in the 1960s era, America. So he just embodies this never give up kind of aura about him, because in order to become a diver, he worked in the mess hall first. He couldn't become a diver. So he writes letter after letter after painstaking letter. He said he wrote 100 letters to even be able to take the test to even try to be able to become a salvage diver. So finally he gets through, and then he was not given the best education. So it took him 3 long years to be able to pass the tests in mathematics and to be able to pass the tests in chemistry to be able to become a salvage diver. And then a heroic story about him. And there was a movie, you see Men of Honor with Cuba Gooding Jr. played him, big smile on his face. I'm sure he was glad to see his life portrayed in that way. He consulted a lot on that movie, by the way. But so he's a salvage diver now, and he's diving for an atomic bomb. So he comes back up, he's with his comrades, and a pole falls, like a wire snaps, and he pushes his comrades out of the way, and it crushes his leg. So his leg is amputated. Does he give up? No, he doesn't give up. They said he needed to leave the Navy. He says, I'm not going to do that. So he takes his prosthetic, and he's put through all these grueling tests, which they showed in the movie, where he had to carry like 300 pounds with this prosthetic leg. He's climbing, he's having to run, he's having to do all these things. And in spite of being an amputee, he still becomes not only the first Black man, but the first amputee to gain the highest ranking of a naval officer in the military, first one to do it. So very fascinating story there with Carl Bashir. And it just reminds me of that quote where it says, try again, fail better. He just failed, but he never gave up, and he kept on trying to do what he did. So a very fascinating figure in history.
Oh, Andy, unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Jermaine. What a great role model. We appreciate that. Remember, if you have questions, go ahead and send them if you have questions for the panelists, go ahead and send them, write them in on the chat feature or on Facebook on the messages there if you're watching on Facebook. Last but certainly not least, our Amanda Brady, our curator here at the Fraser History Museum, ready to introduce us to even more names that we're going to be hearing about and learning about tonight, represented here in the Fraser and our Cool Kentucky exhibition.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so the three people that I'm going to be talking to you about are all featured in our Inventive Kentucky section of the Cool Kentucky exhibit. This is a section of the exhibit that really focuses on cool inventors and inventions from Kentucky. So the first person that I'm going to talk about is Garrett Morgan. And actually yesterday, my colleague at the Fraser was telling me that his son, who's in preschool, was learning about Garrett Morgan in school today. So hopefully that is a good sign that his story is not quite as hidden as it once was. So Garrett Morgan was born to formerly enslaved parents in Kentucky. And he was forced to quit school at the age of 14, where he got a job as a handyman. And later he got a job at a clothing manufacturer. And this is where he first learned how to take care of machines. He had a job repairing the sewing machines at this clothing manufacturer. His first ever invention was a belt fastener for these sewing machines. And he also invented a hair straightening cream and some other hair products. He is most well known for what you see on the screen here. This is the first page of his patent for a 3-position stoplight. He was one of the first people to invent that, and it is a precursor to the stoplights that we use today. He also invented a smoke hood, which is what you see here. This hood, it was a really early version of the gas mask, and it had a window that would protect his eyes, and the tubes that you see going down would actually go below the smoke and pick up fresh air to pump into your mask. And Garrett Morgan actually used that invention to personally rescue some workers that had been trapped in a water intake tunnel 50 feet below Lake Erie. And I do want to point out that even though Garrett Morgan had so many cool inventions and did so much cool machine stuff, he was also really active in his community, and he was a co-founder of the Cleveland Association of Colored Men, which later merged with the Cleveland NCAA, or NAACP, sorry, not basketball. So who you see on the screen there is Elijah Mccoy. He was born to two formerly enslaved parents who had escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad. So you might not recognize his full name, but I'm sure that you've heard of him. If you know the saying, the real McCoy, a lot of people attribute that to him. So he lived with his parents in Canada, and at the age of 15, he went to Edinburgh, Scotland for an apprenticeship, and he actually was certified in Scotland as a mechanical engineer. When he moved back to Michigan with his family, he wasn't able to get any kind of engineering job, so he was forced to work as a fireman and an oiler on the Michigan Central Railroad. It was here working on trains that McCoy came up with his invention that he's most well known from, and that was an automatic lubricator for oiling the steam engines on both locomotives and on ships.
Go to the next one.
So that is the invention that got him that saying, the real McCoy. Engineers on the railroad would ask and make sure that their engine was equipped with the real McCoy system. So McCoy actually filed for more than 50 patents and was recognized in Booker T. Washington's Story of the Negro as having produced more patents than any other Black inventor up to that point. And another little interesting tidbit about Elijah McCoy, he actually was featured in an ad for Old Tailor Bourbon that appeared in a 1966 ad in Ebony magazine. And in that they quoted, but the most famous legacy McCoy left his country was his name. And the picture that you see now is Frederick McKinley Jones. he was born in Cincinnati, but he actually was raised by a Catholic priest in Covington. His mother abandoned the family and his father was unable to care for the child. So he was raised by this priest who believed that the color of his skin didn't matter, and he raised him as a typical young Irish or Catholic boy would have been raised at the time. So he actually became a mechanic at the age of 14, and he served in the US Army during both World War I and World War II, where he often repaired machines and other equipment during the war. He is best known for inventing what you see here. It is a portable air cooling machine for trucks, and this allowed fresh produce and meat to be transported all across the country. While in the Army during World War II, he developed this refrigeration system for applications for the war. So he figured out a way to use them to cool the cockpits and engines of various aircrafts. And they were used to transport blood plasma through the Pacific theater of the war. And he actually also filed for over 60 patents, and most were related to this refrigeration, but others dealt with X-rays machines, engines, and sound equipment.
All right, Amanda, thank you so much. We appreciate it. We've certainly learned a lot here. And Andy, how many times did you say, I didn't know that tonight?
Oh yeah, we can
A lot.
certainly hear those people now. The hidden histories are not as hidden as they were. We want to get to our audience questions, and for that we turn to Cheryl White, Fifth Third with the African American Business Resource Group at Fifth Third. They're the sponsor of tonight's program. Cheryl, briefly a little bit about your group, and then let's jump right into those questions.
Hi, my name is Cheryl White, like you said, and I'm here with my counterpart, Tony Cook. Both of us manage Fifth Third branches. Tony's at the Jeffersontown, and I'm at 15th and Broadway.
We saw her in the
Tony's
back
popping
there.
in and out. Okay. So we're both co-chairs of the African American Business Resource Group with Fifth Third Bank. And with that group, we're representing all the markets that Fifth Third is located in. And we work on recruiting, developing, retaining African American employees in order to establish and diversify various lines of businesses. We're so grateful that each and every one of you all have joined us this evening. I am one to say I have learned a lot, and this has been awesome for me, and I hope it's been that way for you as well. So with that, we're going to get into some questions.
Yeah, Cheryl, do you have any there from anybody in the audience that we can ask our panelists?
I do. I have a couple. The first one is for Jermaine. And the question is, what was the first and most memorable hidden history of or figure from Kentucky that resonated with you? Or what's a story you'd want more people to know?
Ooh, Jermaine, let's have you unmute. Thank you, sir.
I think for me, it would have been York. I remember learning about, the Lewis and Clark story when I was, coming up, but I didn't really hear about York as a part of that expedition and the contribution that he, that he gave to that. So I think that was very eye-opening for me and just kind of wanted me to explore more Kentucky hidden history for sure.
Cheryl, another question from our audience.
There's a question for Amanda. What considerations went into the betrayal or enslaved persons in your Natural Kentucky section of the exhibit?
Yeah, so for Cool Kentucky, it was a particular challenge that we wanted to make sure everyone that was in the exhibit was cool. So we really tried our best to eliminate anyone who may have been a slaveholder or may have been a Confederate and those types of considerations. But there was one group of men that I had a really hard time eliminating, and that was some of the original European explorers that came into Kentucky. These men were slaveholders, but these early explorers are such a part of Kentucky's history that we wanted to include those explorers, but also honor the enslaved people that came with them. So for every
Whoops, I think she froze up.
Yeah, Amanda's freezing up a little bit there, but
we came with.
she did a really amazing job in telling this story, because for every one of those explorers, she included one of the enslaved people, and said Kentucky would not be what it is today without both the enslaved person and the explorer, and they were both as important to the fulfillment of that story and what we are as a state to the end result. And Amanda, you froze up, so I just picked it up there a little bit.
All right, we were
Sounds good.
trying to get that. Cheryl, any other questions from our audience?
No, that's all we have at this time.
All right, and I saw another person asked where Carl Bashir was born, and they said Tonyville, Kentucky. Annie, I know we were running a little bit slim on time, but I think maybe just final thoughts from
No,
each.
I think we've got time to bounce around and our audience can stay with us. But yeah, I'd love to get some final thoughts on everyone. Let's start with you, Jermaine. Anything you've learned tonight, any final thoughts on the program or what you want to leave folks behind with?
And go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always learning, so I think that's the key, is just always be learning, always be seeking and searching, and just realize that through stories like this, that it's all about connecting to the humanity of not only those in Kentucky, but just Black history in general. So I encourage everybody. I know Rachel's going to be putting out a list. I recommended a couple of books that really spoke to me in regards to Black history. So definitely, continue to grow and learn.
And we'll let people know what we do is we compile that list, and all of our panelists have given us their recommendations to further education. So we'll be sending that out to all of our audience members. So expect that in the next couple of days. So Jermaine, thank you. Do you want to unmute and plug real fast just where people can find your website?
Yeah, I run a website and a podcast called The Humanity Archive. So that's on iTunes. It's on Spotify, anywhere where you get your podcasts. I've told stories ranging from Ida B. Wells to Crispus Attucks. It's a narrative storytelling format, and then the educational website at thehumanityarchive.com. So
Thank you so much, Jermaine. Really appreciate you. Always add so much to the panels I've been part of. Christine, let's go to you in Cincinnati. Your final thoughts tonight.
I was really struck listening to everybody about how much research had to go into all of this. None of these histories jumped out as an easy thing. It's worth the effort, is what I'm getting from everybody's stories here.
Thank you, Christine. Carol, how about you?
A lot of aspects of the history of Black people are really painful, and it's encouraging. I don't know what to hear about the stories of resilience and people who used their skills and intelligence and just sheer grit to really contribute great things to society. It's moving, the perseverance of people.
And Ed, let's have you tell us a little bit. Everybody always looks to you for your words of wisdom. And we're seeing so many of these histories come to light. And as we know, our history books left out so much and so many. Your thoughts as there is this reckoning throughout our country to learn more about these histories that were hidden. Your thoughts on that?
I think it's important for everybody to know that this country was built on the backs of slaves, and it's apparent that we need to share all the history because it's so important, particularly for Black youth, to see images of themselves out in that public sector. As I make a memorial, or other artists make memorials or paintings and things, how refreshing it is to be able to say that, gee, I'm a part of this process. And that's what this is all about, being a part of the process and not ignored, you see. For so many years, like you said, the history books just did not tell our story. And so our stories are coming up. Raises like cream, it comes up, and the truth will prevail. And this is so important. I wanted to tell Jermaine, I have an artifact from Isaac Hathaway. I have his calipers that came to me by way of one of his curators that curated his estate. And so I feel a part of him at this point, you see. So these stories all of you guys told tonight have been fantastic. And I've learned a lot. And I look forward to hearing more of these stories as we progress through this pandemic that we're going through now. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Andy. And thank the rest of you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. What an amazing opportunity for museums and locations that are featured here to tell these stories and to frame them through new eyes and new voices. I mean, what a huge opportunity. We all grew up with certain history books that told just a small part of history. So there is a huge opportunity for all of us moving forward. And I know, speaking for our staff here at the Fraser History Museum, we really look forward to that. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight. We want to thank our great audience and obviously our sponsor, Fifth Third Bank.
And we also to remind you about our next panel that we're getting ready to have. It is Trailblazers Among Us with some incredible women from our community. You might recognize some of those faces there. It will be Tuesday, March the 16th. From 6 to 7 p.m. And we hope to see you then with some more amazing stories. And this is part of our Let's Talk Bridging the Divide series. Andy?
And to learn much more about all the amazing people who are spoken about tonight, we hope to see you here at the Fraser History Museum, all of them featured here in great detail. You can also learn about them at our respective organizations that are represented on the panelists tonight. Thank you very much, and keep watch on the Ohio River for York. Great work, Mr. Hamilton. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.